Welcome to R&R Live and Life. There are quite a few people who have commented that the Mereenie Loop is the worst road in Australia. Well, we were about to see what all the hype was about for ourselves. Rick had checked both the boat and Gidget, while I double-checked what I could or had some idea about, so that we were ready to leave the following morning. Though a little apprehensive, but not overly worried, as we had travelled the Great Central Road last year, with only a couple of things to worry about, the fridge coming loose and the microwave unhappy with the corrugations, but had them both fixed and were confident that both the boat and Gidget would be okay. We were not intending to make any stops at gorges or rock holes along the way, other than to check over the boat and Gidget, so our journey today would take us back to Alice Springs. We left Kings Canyon Discovery Resort in Wataka National Park around 8, travelling east along the Mereenie Loop, also known as the Mereenie Loop Tourist Drive, an unsealed 156-kilometre section of the Red Centre Way, which links Alice Springs via the West MacDonnell Ranges and the West MacDonnell National Park to Kings Canyon, and is known for its corrugations and washouts. So we had that to look forward to. Yes, you do need a permit, as the loop will take us through areas where 10 distinct Aboriginal languages are spoken. Our first stop for the morning was at Ginty's Lookout, about 30 kilometres from Kings Canyon, with fantastic scenic views back towards Kings Canyon and the road ahead, thanks to a vehicle we could make out in the distance, showing us where the road would go. The road leading up to Ginty's Lookout is sealed in the very steep sections to give trucks traction, as this is the main transport route for goods in and out of the nearby Mereenie oil and gas field. We had heard that the loop was described as rough or brutal, but we were open-minded about its condition, maybe having lived for years where dirt, rock, gravel and sandy roads were the norm. So we were not surprised as we experienced corrugations, along with rocky and jagged sections, as well as soft sandy patches, and we were only just beginning our journey. The locality of Mereenie in the southwest of the Northern Territory is about 250 kilometres west of Alice Springs. The Mereenie oil field, a source of oil and gas in the Amadeus Basin, was discovered in 1963 and began production in 1984. The Amadeus Basin is a large intercartonic sedimentary basin made of marine and non-marine sedimentary rocks, lying mostly within the southern Northern Territory, but extending into Western Australia. The oil field is connected to Darwin by the Amadeus gas pipeline and to Alice Springs by an oil pipeline. This remote region of the Northern Territory offered us a unique outback, filled with rugged landscapes and indigenous heritage. While the loop is shorter to Alice Springs, it takes much longer to drive and requires a lot more concentration and navigational skills from the driver and on the vehicle than on the bitumen alternative back through Aldunda. Rick knew how much he could push the boat with Gidget in tow and what she was capable of, but it was those unexpected things that you can't prepare for that are always in the back of your mind. The middle of the road had been gravelled, while some sections looked like 4 lanes, so got to choose which line would give us the smoothest track. We could see where it had been wet and people had driven on the soft edges rather than on the gravel, and around soft dust patches. We saw evidence of stallions in quite a few places, with piles of manure in the middle of the road. We encountered wild brumbies grazing beside the road, and were on the lookout for camels and dingoes, but we didn't see any. We did get to see a number of very healthy donkeys feeding beside the road, and some cattle grazing. These animals were introduced into this fragile environment, as they originally served a purpose, either as domestic pets or animals, or in the case of camels, to provide transport. I would have to say the horses we saw are also a feral species, once used on stations that are no longer there, so were released or avoided capture to run wild rather than be managed. Feral animals eat the plants and drink available water, meaning that native animals must compete for resources, with the effects of this competition more severely felt during the drought when native animal populations may already be reduced to a bare minimum. Even the most invasive species, bufflegrass, a perennial tussock grass native to Africa, India and Asia, that was first introduced in the 1870s for erosion control and pastoral purposes, has since spread widely across most land types in the area. The grass chokes out native grasses, destroying habitats for native animals, and provides fuel for wildfires. Overgrazing by cattle and introduced animals, including horses, camels, donkeys, and rabbits, are also a threat to habitats along this stretch of the road. There had been rain about a couple of weeks before we had made our trip, with water still evident in some of the culverts along the edge of the road, and in potholes we made our way around, while some of the watercourses where water had washed across the road were washed out and quite rough. The desert oaks, spinifex and bufflegrass were all responding well to the rain, with everywhere we looked looking so refreshed and healthy, starkly contrasting against the red earth ranges. The scenery was breathtaking. We slowed for where washouts had occurred, signed with red triangles, and stayed well clear of those on the edge of the road. There were some pretty nasty ones, especially with some of the bulldust holes on the reverse side of crests that caught us out on one, but thankfully we were not travelling all that fast, so wasn't an issue. There was plenty of road signs advising to reduce speed and to drive to conditions. I am always amazed by people who drive like they are attacking the road, and often wonder how their vehicles survive. Do they really enjoy the scenery they are passing through at such a speed, or is it just another item to tick off as having been done and dusted? Rick and I had set out on our caravan trips to look at the country, to see how other rural people use the land, so not just swimming holes and campfires at night, as there are others who tick off those sites. The corrugations, washouts and soft sand in places made for slow going, and we were stopping about every 50 kilometres to check over the boat and gidget and to just walk around and stretch our legs. After many twists and turns, crests and dips, we encountered the unusual edge of the Gardner Range at the northern end of the McDonnell Ranges, a series of bare quartzite and sandstone parallel ridges that rise from a plateau 600 metres above sea level. The McDonnell Ranges extends east and west of the town of Alice Springs for about 380 kilometres. Though the road was rough in places, Rick and I were enjoying the drive. In some spots the corrugations were quite bad, while in others the road was smooth. It was constantly changing. The scenery too was forever changing as well. One side of the road could be very different from the other, especially with the driver's side being closer to the range. Even the vegetation, sometimes sparse, while in other places quite condensed depending on the species. Often we could make out where watercourses were by the gum trees that grew along the banks, as they are more dependent on water. Along the top of the range were cliffs in various heights and shades of reddish colour, and we could easily see where erosion had carved gullies in the softer sections of the range. Even the position of the sun caused shadows on the cliffs and areas of deep, darker greens. We could see where the creeks had flowed into the flood country, leaving some areas bare. We could then top a rise, and the country would be different again. I could only imagine what it would be like in drier times. When planning our trips, whenever we had read about going to Alice Springs, the first thing that would come to mind was the McDonnell Range. It was the must-see destination of Central Australia. We had been to Stanley Chasm and Simpson's Gap on our last visit, both amazing places, but only a very small section of the range, so to drive along some of its length was next level. At over 600 kilometres in length, the range is a series of mountains, consisting of parallel ridges running to the east and west of Alice Springs, with both the East and West McDonnell Ranges containing many spectacular gaps and gorges, as well as areas of Aboriginal significance. Some 300 to 350 million years ago, a mountain building event created the McDonnell Ranges. Since that time, folding, fracturing and erosion have shaped the range and created numerous gaps and gorges encompassing an area of around 4 million hectares. The ranges are composed of many rock types, but are most famous for their red quartzite peaks and gorges. Other rock types include granite, limestone, sandstone and siltstone. Some of the valleys in the range contain fossil evidence of the inland sea that once covered Central Australia. It really is an amazing mountain range. Rick and I had discussed which of the two options we had when returning to Alice Springs and had decided on the Mereenie Loop Larapinta Drive route, the more direct route to Alice Springs. The more touristy route along the Glen Helen Loop includes many of the touristy bucket list places said to be more scenic than the more direct route, but we were still impressed by the scenery we saw along the way. I am amazed by people who choose to ride their bikes through such a remote area as this. We had seen some in the most unexpected places, and here was no different. To challenge oneself to ride such long distances without support is beyond me. Out in the middle of the Mereenie Loop we passed 3 such bike riders. Rick and I presumed they were travelling together, albeit in a good distance apart to allow motor vehicles to pass safely, but in the middle of the road. Thankfully there was enough road left on either side to make passing safe. To carry enough water would be my biggest concern, even in the winter months, and the repairs to tyres having to ride over such a rough road. So I take my hat off to them for having the courage to challenge themselves to complete such a distance. As much as I love the open spaces, the solitude and the raw beauty of the area, I certainly don't have the courage or the willpower to attempt such a journey. On reaching the turn-off to Glen Helen and the bitumen, we stopped to re-inflate the tyres on the boat and Gidget. The flies were horrendous, so ended up having coffee in the boat. We were now further away from the McDonnell Ranges, but could see them on the horizon. As it was closer to midday, they appeared bluish-purple against the paler blue sky. The red sand swales covered in desert oaks, with shrubs in various shades of green interspersed amongst the golden bufflegrass, was a sight to see. Once back on the bitumen, we passed the northern side of the Fink Gorge National Park and then the Owen Springs Reserve, and were impressed with the blue hues of the Waterhouse Range in the distance. We crossed the Fink River at Hermannsburg and then the Hugh River. While in many places along the length of the Hugh River the river is dry, but there are some places that retain water. The Fink River, or Larapinta in the indigenous Arunti language, courses through the West McDonnell Ranges and is one of the 4 main rivers of Lake Eyre Basin, with major tributaries including Ellery Creek and the Palmer and Hugh Rivers. It is thought to be the oldest riverbed in the world, flowing for only a few days a year. When this happens, its water usually disappears into the sands of the Simpson Desert, rarely, if ever, reaching Lake Eyre. About half an hour after we had started on the bitumen, we passed Hermannsburg on the Fink River, established as a Lutheran Aboriginal mission in 1877, with the mission land handed over to the traditional owners in 1982. In those early years of the mission, the Lutherans worked at keeping the local languages alive, even creating a Western Arunti language version of the Lutheran hymn book comprising 53 hymns. Just out of Hermannsburg, we stopped at the memorial to Albert Namatjira, who was born in Hermannsburg, a noted painter who depicted the desert landscape of Central Australia using detailed Western art-influenced watercolours. I am sure there are many people out there who will remember sitting in school classrooms in the 60s and 70s when his paintings were on display. About 50 kilometres west of Alice Springs was Owen Springs Reserve, a 1,570 square kilometre protected area that was formerly a cattle station. The reserve is dissected by the Hugh River with broad sandy banks lined by shady river red gums and landscape filled with rocky gorges and red sand country. Stuart, William Kilwick and Benjamin Head were the first white men to travel through this country in 1860, while making their way northwards along the Hugh River. One of the immediate results of Stuart's exploration was construction of the overland telegraph line that originally followed the Hugh River through Lawrence Gorge in the Waterhouse Range. Even before the line was completed in August 1872, cattleman William Gilbert was on his way from South Australia to establish a cattle station here. The old Owen Springs homestead ruins is the site of the first station homestead built in Central Australia. We passed the turn-off to Simpson's Gap and Stanley Chasm, both sites we had visited in July 2024, before turning off Larapinta Drive and making our way via Honeymoon Gap. That was once officially known as Templar Bar Gap, located on Roe Creek, to where we were to camp just outside of Alice Springs. The gap is a water gap through a low ridge in the range formed by the creek. What a day it had been! The scenery along the Mereenie Loop was truly stunning, and both Rick and I enjoyed the drive. Rick was quite happy to let others pass and slowed until visibility was clear. We took our time and enjoyed every minute of the drive. Then, who could not with such incredible views, with landscapes backed by towering red gorges, wide open flats and clear blue skies? It was an unforgettable journey. The Mereenie Loop gave us a raw, unfiltered taste of the centre. The track was often heavily corrugated, with sandy patches and rocky gravel sections that demanded Rick's full attention behind the wheel. Would we do it again? Yes, we sure will. Without a doubt, one of the most iconic scenic road trips we have taken. I hope you have enjoyed our trip along the Mereenie Loop Larapinta Drive. Give us a thumbs up if you have. Join us next time as we continue our travels through Alice Springs and on to the Devil's Marbles. Stay safe and enjoy life. Cheers for now. Rick and Rosemary. R&R, Living Life.